Good morning, CHD. It is August 12th, and I'm here with James Corbett and Wolfgang Wodarg. We're going to talk about the WHO. We're going to talk about how decisions are made in Europe, and I'm going to learn a lot from these two gentlemen. The first thing I really want to know is where the power is in Europe. How are decisions made? You have a European Parliament. You have a Council of Europe, you have a European Commission, you have a president of the Council of Europe, and you have a European Union. So how do things happen?
This is different organizations with their own history, and we have national states in Europe. And some national states are centralized, like France, for instance. Others have a federal construction. And within those national states, the power concerning certain politics is located or allocated to regional governments. Some and others are, like defense is always a national thing, but the police, for instance, is a regional federal thing in some countries. In Germany, for instance. And so the national states are different. And after the Second World War, there was this big crash, and they all wanted to have this fascist systems, and they never wanted such crimes again. And there was the Charter of Human Rights was in Europe was formulated. Also, it were all European states did it. Was the Council of Europe did it was first after the Second World War. It was in 1948, and then in 1951 they started working. After some years, even the Eastern European countries were members. It was big Europe, and when I was there, were all European countries except Belarus. So Russia was member, and Turkey was member, and many states.
So this is the Council of Europe.
This is the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe, this is the foreign ministers. The foreign ministers who gather there, they are representing the governments. And then, which is a special thing, there's a parliamentary assembly. And this is delegations from all member states, and those delegations, they are put together not only by governing parties, but also by opposition. So all parties, according to their share in parliament, they may send delegates there. The big countries, the big European countries, they have 18 delegates. The task of it to go for human rights, democracy, and rule of law. Those three pillars are the pillars of the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe also had an agreement that they set up their own justice, their own system of justice. They made the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, and this is a court where when you don't get your rights in your national state, when you have your state is developed in a totalitarian way, and the media is suppressed and whatever, you can go, but you first have to go to the national courts, and when your national courts don't help you, then you can go and address the courts of the human rights courts in Strasbourg. And so this is a special thing. And the human rights courts can condemn national states. They have to pay money, and they have to do everything to fix the damage they did. So this is one thing. And then there is this European Union. This was an economic group of states. It started with Italy, France, and Germany, and it was the Central European states, and it grew. And they had certain process of adopting other states too. And after the fall of the wall, they adopted many Eastern states too. So the last was Croatia. They always understood themselves as a competitor, an economic competitor in the global in the global economy, in the global trade. They wanted to be a science-based, strong science-based federation of European states, and they had the subsidiary principle. So they promised the national states that they could care for their own things, for their culture, for their health. Health was always excluded. European Union had nothing to do with health, but they started more and more to take little bits of it. They started, yes, but it's not health when you deal with drugs. This is just goods. And so they started getting control over the drugs. And they even wanted to have the service provider. They wanted to have a service regulation for workers in all over Europe. They wanted to unify this. There was a big struggle about that. So because the advantage of the European Union is that you have the right to live in any member state, and you can pass the borders without control. You could. Before COVID, you could. And then you can also live in other states. And so they have agreements that if your health insurance is in Germany, you can go into a hospital in Greece, and they pay according to their contracts between the member states. They have certain regulations so that you can live all over Europe and you can move freely. You could move freely all over Europe. This was the advantage. And then they implemented the euro, the currency. They did it in 2000, but not all member states followed. Those lucky member states who still have their own currency, they are much easier able to correct the value of their currency, and while the others are dependent on the euro and they are bound together. And then there were many more organizations. Each member state became an agency. You know, when you become a member, then you get an agency. And so when Sweden became member of the European Union, they got the ECDC. This is for the CDC of Europe. Yep. Center for Disease Control Europe.
Let me narrow this a little. Who has control of healthcare? How is that managed?
It's a national matter. Healthcare is a national matter. We have a health insurance system.
Okay, so why did Ursula von der Leyen buy all the vaccines for the EU?
I don't know. There must be contracts between the national states and the EU that they do something for all of them. But this only can happen if the national states agree, and they say it's an advantage. It's an advantage for us when you do it for all of us.
Okay, so she lost the tweets where she supposedly negotiated with Bourla, the head of Pfizer, and her husband apparently runs a company that's a sort of a subsidiary, a spin-off of Pfizer.
Big conflict of interest.
So she winds up contracting for about 4 or 5 billion doses of COVID vaccines. Who oversees her?
Nobody. The Commission can just do what they want to do. There are some regulations that the European Parliament, which is directly elected delegates, the politicians are directly in their constituency, in their national constituency, they are elected in the European Parliament. They could ask questions, and they are able to can get transparency if they want. But very often the Commission said we cannot give this transparency because there are secrets, economic secrets, and there are interests of the enterprises, of the partners, of the private partners, and so on. And it was always a big fight between parliamentarians and the Commission. The Commission is much stronger, and it is stronger because the member state, the governments, they tolerate that. the governments very often are not so fond of parliaments. So the governments make their deals with the commission. And this is very often intransparent. And there are such deals, you give me something, I give you something. This is such an exchange market. And it's very intransparent.
So the members of the commission are not elected? I mean, who becomes a commissioner?
They are elected, but this is funny because Ursula von der Leyen was not a candidate which was going for election. She was suddenly there. She was suddenly taken. And the parliament was very surprised. But this was a deal which was prepared secretly. And there was a big surprise when she became the commissioner. And I think this has to do with the member states. This is such a deal. If a member state gets the position of the commissioner, the other member states want something for this, and so on. And there is no transparency.
Okay. Let's go to the WHO. How are decisions made at the WHO?
Yeah, the WHO has certain sub-organizations who are specialized, and they propose their results to the Secretary General, and the Secretary General always is the one who says, we take it or we don't take it, we reject it. So he is the one when there is a group of people who are also selected under the influence of the Secretary General, and he can choose the people who decide, who are members of the working groups. So he can, and it's very intransparent too. There is a certain list of people, and the nations can propose the members of such groups. And those groups, specialized groups for special topics, they give the advice, and they meet several times a year, some more often, some less often. But then the Secretary General just takes this, and he gives them also, he asks them questions, he gives them the topics they should discuss on, and such things. So the Secretary General is most important.
Okay, so you're describing a dictator, and I believe that that's the case, because when the Secretary General had his expert group look at monkeypox twice, they voted against declaring it a public health emergency of international concern twice. And the second time the vote was 9-6. And he came in afterwards and said, well, it was almost a tie, so I broke the tie and I decided to make it a PHEIC, even though only 6 people had voted in favor. So there doesn't seem to be anybody overseeing him either. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I just remember this with Margaret Chan when she suddenly changed the definition of pandemics because
yes.
there were no cases and there were no people ill, and so she suddenly decided that they should change the definition, because what was decided that WHO should put in power all those contracts which were made before. There were big economic consequences from this decision, and those stakeholders behind, who were the pharmaceutical industry and national interests, they were making pressure that now we have invested so much, and our pharmaceutical industry has invested so much. We have given hundreds of millions for such jabs, and now nothing happens. So they said, now we have a pandemic.
Let me change the subject a little bit. I'm going to ask James, what are the Sustainable Development Goals? And I'm going to ask you, Wolfgang, what do they really mean? So, how did they get there, and how are they being imposed on us now? So, James.
Well, I would just say that they were unveiled to the public in 2015 amid much fanfare as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And theoretically, these are goals towards achieving the objectives of sustainable development, whatever that means in the eyes of the beholder. But I think in order to really understand what they mean, you have to go much further in depth into the specifics, because I think people have probably been conditioned, certainly in Japan at this point, people have been conditioned to associate the SDGs with those colorful boxes that basically represent different areas of jurisdiction over the oceans, over ending poverty, things like this, that all sound like laudable goals until you start drilling down on the details. And so, for example, 16.9, the wonderful and benevolent idea of allowing, not of providing the human right of people being allowed to identify themselves, which of course is a human right, right? But of course, what does that actually eventuate in? It starts to bring in the specter of digital identification for everyone, which will of course be tied in at first with vaccination campaigns. That's generally the way that this is being done. And that's why the Global Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, and others have been on board with the digital ID agenda and ID 2020 and associated organizations like that for a long time. It's all being packaged up by the UN in this nice little bow about ending poverty and providing education and what have you. But in the details of these SDGs, we find what it's really about.
Yes, there is the history of WHO is very interesting. They changed a lot. I'm following the WHO for many years, and I was very fond of WHO in 1978 when the Alma Ata Declaration was published, and it was something that made standards, global standards, that everyone has the right at home to be cared for, to be well, to get good health care everywhere where the people lived. All the countries should do something for health. Before, nobody globally cared for health, but the WHO took this over and made itself an organization who said what health is. They defined health. This is the first article, the first text in the contract. And then this is just a gesture that now there is something who defines what health is. Before, it was completely different in many regions, and people understood health as individually even. It's my health. It's nothing for you. Why aren't you interested what I think is healthy when I'm healthy? So it was, suddenly there was someone who set a norm. But first it was a norm which was given up to the states. The states should provide healthcare to everyone. And but this changed with the century, with around 2000. What this changed from, there were the Millennium Development Goals. They were the old ones. They were also goals where the states agreed to do something at home, where they all wanted to do something at home. The national level was still very important, and then they switched over to globalize the whole thing, and they did it with health too. And it's very interesting. In 2021, I found a text which says WHO is called to return to the Declaration of Alma Ata. So someone told WHO to return to Alma Ata, to stop this globalization and this norming of health worldwide. And this made me follow up with this a little bit historically, and I think, just wait. So in the Alma Ata, there was, the people have a right and duty to participate individually and collectively in the planning and implementation of their healthcare. This was Alma Ata. So the people should decide how they want to be healthy and how they want to have their healthcare. There were no norms from WHO. WHO only said, national states, please do something for your people. And what they wanted to do, it was up to them. And then this from Health for All as a social and democratic norm. This was a social norm and a democratic norm where the people could decide themselves. It changed to universal health coverage, which was a proclaimed outcome of market reforms. They wanted a market reform, that the market was open, the health market was open globally for all, for the poor countries, for the rich countries. The rich should help the poor. There was something, a global director, telling what to do with the healthcare.
Yes, so let me interrupt you. That is part of the new draft of the pandemic treaty. And although WHO says they're interested in healthcare, in fact, what the treaty has over and over again is coverage, which means insurance. They want everybody to be offered health insurance. Now, that might be fine, but what if you're, in the middle of a rural area and there are no healthcare facilities? They still want you to be required to buy health insurance. And the language is designed to be confusing. So they use the term coverage instead of care almost everywhere throughout these documents.
Yes, and they don't want the people to self-organize. They want insurance companies.
Right.
There is insurance companies, and they want, when you force the people to get an insurance, you needn't ask them to please make an insurance with me, and it could be good for you. But no, you just force them by state. You say you have to buy an insurance, and this is what they want. This is what they did in Germany too. There is obligatory insurance. You have to be insured, and it's getting more and more expensive. So they can press the private money out of the people with the help of the states, and yes. They use this health arguments. You have to be insured. For everyone has to be insured, so that everyone is covered. And this is just a trick to widen the private business with the insurance business.
So let me mention, you have a new book, False Pandemics. People should really consider buying this book because it has a ton of information about what's been going on with pandemics, with healthcare, with money, with conflicts of interest, etc. So consider it. But in this book, you inform us that somehow a subsidiary of Bertelsmann, which is a huge media company, it owns Random House and Penguin Books. It's the fourth largest music company in the world. It got a hold somehow through the German government of the medical records of 90% of Germans through their insurance companies. How does that happen?
It was a good, successful lobby work. And it was a health minister who was a lobbyist himself. He had a lobby firm as a parliamentarian. He had shares, 25% shares in a lobby firm. When he was with me in the health committee, I met him there, and we didn't know it, but he had. And then when it was found out, he sold them. But he became minister, and he had a good friend. He bought a house from him. And this friend, he made the boss of an institution which should gather all the medical data. And this is a trick which was established in 2004 already. It was a trick because we have a competition of health insurances, of state health insurances. You have to be in a state health insurance. They all have to do the same thing for you, almost for the same price. But there is a competition, which is a little different in price and so on. And because some of those health insurances, there were all those old people, those pension people with little money and so on, and very ill. So they spend a lot of money and they didn't get so much income. And others, there were the young engineers paying a lot and never being ill. So there was they had some risk. How do you say? The rich
risk pools.
Yes, and to estimate how much they should give, one insurance should give the others, they have to collect the data. You have to know how many people is in one insurance. And so from that, this was a trick that all the individual risk data of health, of the health data, which treatment, which diagnosis, and so which pharmaceutic were prescribed, everything had to be registered, and now it's digitalized. And it has to be, the data were given to the health insurance, and the health insurances, they have a central, and before, this were the doctors and the health insurances who handled the data, and they should administer this. So the government was out. It should be a self-governed thing.
Mm-hmm.
But this Mr. Spahn, this minister, he certainly made a proposal. It was in another initiative, in a legal initiative. He just inserted there that the government took over 51% of this institution. So they gave some money. They bought themselves into this institution, and in the same time he could decide who will become the director of this institution. This was his friend, and his friend immediately made a contract with Bertelsmann, which is a big company. And Bertelsmann has a sub enterprise which is called Avato. Avato is specialized on digital data, and they deal with all this data. So they have now a collection of health data of all German people there, and they know who gets which drug and which doctor prescribes it, and they know the diagnosis, they know what the hospitals do, they know everything. Also, only because the reason is because the competitors, there has to be fair competition. There's no competition necessary, not at all. And I always proposed that we should have in the federal countries, we still have 16 countries in Germany, federal, that all those insurance companies should go together with one budget, and there should only be such a money flow between the 16 länder, so that you don't need the data of the ill people, and this would be very easy, but they don't want it. They need the data. They do it because of the data, because of the knowledge, because of the market, which is transparent for them now. And nobody who is employed as a doctor, nobody is employed in the health insurance. In we have 100 health insurances, step by, which all do the same. And nobody knows where the data goes and what is done with them. It's very intransparent, very complicated.
All right. I'm going to ask you about another thing you've mentioned, and I'd like to know what it is. I hadn't heard of it before. 1+ million genomes. What is that?
This is a European initiative, which is a private-public partnership initiative with Google and others. There's the data firms did it, and they said we need genetic data because we want to know more how people get ill and which risks there are for science. We need it.
Of course.
But this was just taken to have, and they could collect data now during the PCR tests. They had this data from each nose if they wanted, and there were many of such labs that were able to sequence human genome, and at the same time they make the PCR. They offered the PCR, and nobody controlled it. And it's also with ancestry. This offer when you want to know your ancestors. You always
Ancestry.com or 23andMe or some other companies where you pay $99 and they'll tell you where you come from or what your genes are for certain disease risks. But you have signed away the right for them to use your genetic material. And so there, it sounds like if everybody who got a PCR test, that's about 440 Europeans in the EU. How many genomes might Google and its partners have?
I don't know. I only know that there were Chinese labs coming to Europe, making the PCR test here in Serbia and in other countries on the Balkan, and I don't know where. So they came with containers and they made the labs there and they made PCR tests. They offered it. We help you to get to fight COVID-19. And it was those big labs from China who were specialized on sequencing human data who came.
Okay, so the new draft of the treaty requires all nations to set up genomics and sequencing labs. Every country has to do that. Now, how does that make sense?
No, it doesn't make sense. That only makes sense from the economic side. If you want to threaten people, if you want to tell them, oh, you have a genome, which is you may be at risk for something, and we can sell you something that may help you. So such things is the only. It's such a fear marketing, fear mongering with genome risks, genetic risks, and this is one thing. And perhaps they develop some things they want to sell us, but that we just experience how far we are and how far we will be for many, many years when we think we could interfere with our genetic information, complicated information exchange within our body. It's so complicated. There are so many factors all the time being dependent. Each factor is depending on many others, and there is a big network of information within our body, between our cells, and that it's not a thing you can calculate. It's not trivial. It's life. It's not trivial. Life is not trivial. You cannot calculate life, and if you calculate life, the result is something dead.
Yes. So Robert F. Kennedy got a lot of criticism because he mentioned the possibility of genetic weapons designed for people with certain genotypes, yes, certain genes. And he was scoffed at. He was rudely treated by members of Congress and others and the whole media. But in fact, I did a lot of work on biological warfare in South Africa and Zimbabwe. And in South Africa, it was obvious, there were lots of publications that the South Africans were working on genetic weapons, because they were worried that the Black population was going to outproduce people compared to the whites, and the whites would lose control. And this was prior to 1993. When they achieved majority rule. So this is over 30 years ago. They were working on genetic weapons. We know that other nations have done it. Probably our own nation has done it. And that is one reason why it's very dangerous to allow your genome to be, if you have the right to stop it, you may not. Because every time you give blood to get a blood test, the white blood cells could be used for sequencing your genome. So we don't know who has this, but there are laws in the United States about genetic privacy. So it's not something that should be done legally, but it may be getting done anyway. All right. You mentioned that there was a pandemic flu plan that came about in 1999 when Gro Harlem Brundtland was the head of the WHO. And even though it had mainly industry-sponsored people writing the plan, it seems to have been somewhat reasonable. Then it changed with the 2005 international health regulations. And then for COVID, neither of these plans were followed. So, are you able to discuss that? What were the changes? How were things changed for COVID and why?
I think they just had this process and it started with Gro Harlem Brundtland. It started with her. She was a Norwegian minister. She was always fond of ecological topics, and she was very close to the World Economic Forum as a president of Norway already. And they elected her. They choose her that she would be a good Secretary General to instrumentalize WHO. They really have chosen, and I have this speech of her from 2001 when she invited the industry to invest in health, and when she invited all those sponsors. Before there was Hiroshi Nakayama, there was a Secretary General before her, and there were big scandals, financial scandals, and so and the WHO ran out of money, and so she came and she used this desolate situation for WHO, which used to be an administration doing some good. And then she came, and she won some sympathy with her tobacco convention. She made this, and there were lots of people that said this is a good thing that WHO does, but this was just one thing. This was just something she did to have sympathies and to get more power. But what she really did, is that she changed the finances of WHO, and that she invited all those sponsors, and that she sold WHO. She sold it, and she gave it to the pharmaceutical industry and to others who wanted to use WHO for their purposes. And then there was this young Wodarg. He was there when the birds flu was there, and he followed the same strategies. The birds flu was an example, and it was the first exercise they did to try out a pandemic. Before there was this SARS outbreak, it was in 2003. It started perhaps in November 2002. It started during Gro Harlem Brundtland's last year. And then they tried out with the PCR. They tried out to have their counting cases with SARS. And Mr. Drosten was already there. They had ill people everywhere in hospitals with lung diseases. And they first thought it's chlamydia. And they said they had many theories what serious lung diseases they have found. But it's not difficult in an 11 million city to find people with serious lung diseases. And when you make a PCR test with them, you get positive tests. Mr. Drosten has showed us how often this test can be positive. And so this was an exercise. And then, but there were the Chinese.
So by that, you're saying that this was a dress rehearsal. Is that right?
Yes. This was how to shape such an outbreak with the help of PCR. This is what they did. This is they didn't have to look for cases anymore. They just had a test, easy test. You can earn money with the test even, and then you go around everywhere, and you have to make it very rapidly because it's always a different virus. So you can have so it's not something you have to prove, and it has to be standardized and such thing. It takes years to make a real test. No, they just make some tests and go on, and they knew exactly what this test would deliver. And this is what they tried out.
And let me point out, if you don't mind. So in the United States, we've had about 275 different PCR tests for COVID, all of them under EUA, emergency use authorized, which means they're not licensed. As long as they're not licensed, the public doesn't have to get any information about them. So they can use different probes, different reagents, different everything. We have no idea what their value is, their sensitivity and specificity. And they're just left out there from time to time, we've gotten different advice from either the WHO or the CDC on what the cycle thresholds should be. So if you want to drum up cases, unbelievably, the CDC recommended cycle thresholds of 45. I couldn't believe it until I saw it with my own eyes. And then the WHO said, no, dial it down.
This is an adjustable pandemic.
Yes, exactly.
You can adjust it, the number of cases, just by doing the cycle threshold or changing the quality, or if you only take the E gene, or what they did so many things. And but they tried it out, and they tried it out again. Mr. Drosten tried it out with MERS. This was not an outbreak, really. This was just some field exercises they did with a PCR test, I think. It was nothing serious there. But
tell us about avian flu also in 2004-05.
This was, yes, with the avian flu, they knew they knew there were some cases, and they found many cases where you have many birds, the mass holding of birds, where thousands of birds are in one stable, and sometimes there were zoonoses, and there was Mr. Stör, he's a veterinary. There are always veterinaries in Germany, the Germans, who are the bosses of the administration of health administrations. They take veterinaries. Funny, but he was there responsible in WHO, and he said, "Oh, there will be millions of dead. This may jump from birds to human beings." And this is the story where I told it, I think, and I wrote about it in my book, that I visited him, and he gave me this CD from Roche, and he recommended Tamiflu. This would help. He had no evidence at all, no evidence, epidemiological evidence, no cases, no growing number of infections, nothing. Nevertheless, there was this alarm of a pandemic. They tried it out again. And Mr. Rumsfeld earned a lot of money with Tamiflu.
Yeah, so Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, had been the chairman of the board of Gilead, which was selling Tamiflu. Tamiflu actually caused a number of suicides in Japan, noted at first. Yes. It was a useless drug. And then Tom Jefferson and Peter Doshi showed that. I remember when it rolled out in the United States, what they told us was it only reduces a flu by 1 day. So completely useless drug, dangerous, but very expensive. And Rumsfeld made a bundle on it. And yeah, our government spent billions stockpiling it.
It has a side effect similar as pervitin a little bit. It makes you awake. So it has such a, and this makes people who are close to suicide jump out of the window. Such things may happen.
Dr. Wodarg, if I can interject for a minute, I have been following your work for a number of years now because I followed the swine flu events quite closely at the time. And I remember the Council of Europe investigation into it. I've cited it many, many, many times because I think it was one of those groundbreaking events where, hey, there's actually some sort of official pushback going on to the obvious scam and psyop that we just witnessed. So I was very glad to see the work that you did on that. And as you note in your book, it seems like essentially that the swine flu, the events of the swine flu was the preparation for what we just lived through for the past few years. So I would be interested to know how it is that you came to focus on that, why that came to your attention and why you decided to pursue that investigation and what you ended up finding.
I was director of a public health institution. I had my flu monitoring, my own flu monitoring. And I knew how many cases you have in serious flu outbreaks. Some years, all 4 or 5 years, there were more. And in between, there were not so many. So when I had up to 8% or 10% of the population had the flu
in any 1 year.
And if you have it in the season, almost 80% of the people get the flu in a season, or sometimes more than 100% because they get twice. And I knew that it's not only
different
one
viruses.
virus. But there are very often 40% of all flu cases, you find 2 viruses. You don't know whether there are more because we don't have tests for the others.
Right.
So there are more than 100 who make the same symptoms. I knew all this. I'm a lung doctor, internal medicine, hygiene. I did all this. I learned all this, and I made my own monitoring. And then I was thinking when I heard about 600 cases in Mexico and WHO telling about pandemic, I said, what's that? In my region, there is 150,000 people living, and there are 10,000 cases maybe possible there. And when I go to the hospital, I see the people there lying in the corridor, and you can see it if there's something serious going on. And I tried to find out what was going on with the swine flu, and I only got those news about those cases from Mexico. And there was this guy from London, this biomathematics, Ferguson, I think his name. Yes, Mr. Ferguson. And he calculated, and I got this his expertise. I thought I was crazy because I saw those 600 cases he multiplied with the flights going all over the world, and then he took a factor 2 point something, and he told us there will be millions of dead all over the world. There was a big pandemic just because he multiplied flights with some 600 cases in a region where tens of millions of people were living. 600 cases, ridiculous it was. And this I saw, and then I said, this cannot be.
Let's talk about advance purchase agreements, which I refer to as sleeper contracts. These were basically secret contracts that the WHO had been sort of the market maker of, bringing together nations and pharmaceutical companies, and the countries had to sign contracts to buy a certain number of vaccines at a certain price for diseases that nobody knew what they would be, or whether the vaccines would be useful, or whether they would be needed. And the WHO would be pulling the trigger. So if you got to a pandemic level 6, this was in the early 2000s, got to a pandemic level 6 declaration by the Director General of the WHO, every country would then be obligated to buy these unknown vaccines at the price established with no liability. So if you tell a company, we need vaccines and you're not going to have any liability, they will produce vaccines. Doesn't matter whether they work or whether they're safe, right? So how did that all happen? Who came up with this idea of advanced purchase agreements? Was that also Gro Harlem Brundtland? How did the WHO become a central player?
This was already the time of Young-wook Lee in Mrs. Chan. So this happened after the bird flu, after 2005. And when they make the pandemic preparedness plans, and they were going for those contracts, for those secret contracts. And in this, we didn't, as a parliamentarian, I was in parliament and on health politics, I didn't know my country was making such contracts before the pandemic was declared by WHO. We were not involved in such things, although it was a lot of money Germany spent. And the other countries, it was the same. I got the contracts by whistleblowers, French contract, German contract. They looked all the same. There was always this: when WHO declares a level 6 of pandemic, then this contract is in power. And Germany, they ordered 50 million doses, Japan 100 million doses, and so on. And then the price was written, also was there in the contract, everything. And they had different ways to produce it. It has to be produced very, very quick. But you have only two possibilities when you don't have so much chicken eggs to breed the virus so quickly. So they took only 1/10 of the normal dose they normally take for flu vaccines, and they put some additive into it. They put some immune booster into it. And this immune booster, this should make those small dose of antigen work as much as normally tenfold dose. But it just stimulated the immune system, and you don't know what the immune system does when you stimulate it. Maybe an autoimmune disease. And this narcolepsia was something like that. It happened. And there were many cases. So in the other ones, they tried out with this bioreactor. They not breeding in eggs, but breeding on some artificial cells. That were cells from dog's kidney they used, and they were in a bioreactor, and they injected the virus on it and so on. So they it was a new technology, and they didn't know whether there could be some strange protein being injected, and cancer could come out of this, and nobody knew it. And it was so all this. I question this, and this is why we had this enquete commission in the Council of Europe.
In that 2009 so-called pandemic, basically it was, if it was really a pandemic, it's not clear, because it certainly in the United States caused fewer deaths than a normal flu season. But it was identified as very, very deadly and dangerous in April of 2009. And then in May, the WHO changed the definition of a level 6 pandemic. So knowing that this thing was coming, they got rid of the requirement that there be many deaths and serious illness. And all they said was, you need a new virus. Of course, there are new viruses all the time. So the new definition made no sense whatsoever. And based on this new definition that was only a month or 6 weeks old, Margaret Chan declared a level 6 pandemic in June.
Yes. Although many member states were very afraid that they would have to pay for a nonsense they don't need. And they questioned WHO.
Which they did, because
press conference.
Yes. Yeah. Poland was the only one that said, we're not buying it. We don't want it.
We interviewed the Minister for Health, and she was a public health doctor too, and she said, no, we don't need this stuff. She was courageous, was very good.
But the other countries not only bought it, but actually used it. The Scandinavian countries, had 80 or 90% of their populations taking this vaccine that was completely unnecessary. And it caused many cases of narcolepsy in the adolescent age group. And it turned out that about 25% of the population, the white population anyway, was genetically susceptible to something presumably in the vaccine. It was only one vaccine. It was the Pandemrix vaccine in Europe. Supposedly an identical vaccine was used in Canada, but Canada didn't report these cases of narcolepsy. Everyone tried to deny that the narcolepsy existed. Finland identified it first. They were very clear that this was happening. And then, neurology, because the narcolepsy was very, very severe. So people were dying from narcolepsy. They were falling asleep while they drove a car, or walking across a street. They'd be hit by a car because they would fall down or fall asleep. And so last I heard, which was many years ago, there were 1,300 cases of very severe narcolepsy, and some of those people committed suicide. But that was due to this vaccine for which there was no manufacturer liability. So individual countries were supposed to make arrangements to pay off people who were injured by the vaccine. And in the UK, the government is still challenging those cases. They don't want to pay them off. Now, in Germany, only some of the people got the adjuvanted vaccine with the novel adjuvant. And the higher echelon people were offered the unadjuvanted higher dose antigen vaccine. So that became a big scandal in Germany when people found out that the higher level government officers and rich people were getting a different vaccine. And so many Germans wound up refusing. That may have been due to your work.
Yes, I've heard that. So there were people who have examined now the COVID vaccine too, the so-called COVID vaccine too, and they've found out that from the diplomatic service, they got vials who were procured there, and they didn't find any stuff in it. It was salt water. It was nothing in it. So maybe there are some, if that important people, important for those who do it, that they are protected by such extra stuff as they did it with the swine flu. Maybe they do this again, and this makes the whole crime still worse. I was asked to witness in a process at court in Ireland the attorney, he was representing 80 parents, 80 cases of narcolepsia. And I had to go to Dublin, but short before, Glaxo said, no, we pay. They didn't want to have a sentence. They didn't want to have a sentence. They gave money, and that's it. So
right.
This is what they often do, because otherwise there would be some sentence others could use for that purpose.
Exactly. So they could seal the documents if they pay off before they go to court. Once they go to court,
Yes.
the other court cases in other countries can obtain the information. Yes. So, and that one vaccine that appears to have caused the narcolepsy cases was all GlaxoSmithKline's vaccine.
Yes.
Do you think any of these pandemics that the WHO has pushed out were real? Was there a pandemic?